Hello, Orville Nation and Nerd TV. How are you guys? How is everybody? And that music that we listened to just now was courtesy of Alan Dean Foster, one of his latest compositions. And it was an honor to be able to debut some of his music, some of Alan's music on Orville Nation. I want to tell you all, I want to thank everybody for coming. We have a very special show. Hey, Steph, Hugh, live at the Love Shack. Captain Robert. Oh, internet is a little bit slow. Sorry. Everybody else who is in here, welcome to everyone. And we're going to bring in our for Culture Casino, Jet Screamer. I see you guys now. Life with Matthew. Jitsi, I'm seeing you guys now. Okay. Welcome to everybody, and I'm going to start bringing in our panel. I'm first going to bring in my co-host George Peter Gatsis, who you all know, and welcome, George. How are you, my friend? Welcome to another amazing treat to be here with Alan, and I'm going to bring in some of our guest panel right now.
Greetings.
Greetings, George.
I'm just so excited. I love that music.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about Alan's musical composition, and it's interesting that Alan is so creative in so many different ways. It's really an honor to be able to talk to him about his other creativities. And let me bring in the our colleague, our lovely colleague, Elaine, Nerd Cookies. Welcome, Elaine.
Hey, everyone. Great to be here. So excited.
It's awesome to have you, Elaine. Thank you so much for joining us, and it's always a pleasure to have Elaine Nerd Cookies on our streams. I also want to welcome our friend and guest panelist, Bird of Prey. Hello, Bird.
Hola, everybody. Thank you.
Kapla. And we have two more guest panelists, where one is going to drop in a little bit later, and our final guest panelist to introduce right now is Anti-Trekker. Hello, Michael.
Hey guys, it's an honor to be here.
It is, and it's an honor to have all of you as well on the panel, and it's such a treat to have Alan here again today. I just want to tell the chat real quick that we're gonna start talking about some stuff that is non-science fiction. Alan's going to share things about himself and about his life, and the fact that he gets to see Bird of Prey in a yellow shirt.
it's technically
it's a Star Trek
issue. Yeah. So it's
nice.
It's cold. Camera color's a little off.
Oh, I see it now. I see the delta now. Well, I think it's time to introduce. It's time to introduce one of the most trusted, revered, and respected names in science fiction. For several decades, he has been known to be the ghost. Well, he has not been known to be the ghostwriter for Star Wars. He has been involved in some fashion in many historic scenes in science fiction that you can think of. Alan's fingerprints are on it either as a creator, co-creator, or storyteller. I really want to stress this, that not even Isaac Asimov or Arthur C. Clarke have had the type of contribution and impact that someone like Alan has had. And it's a very unique privilege to have somebody who's impacted the genre of science fiction so much here. So I want to welcome. I wanted everybody to give a nice warm welcome, please, to our friend Alan Dean Foster. Welcome, Alan.
Welcome.
Hi, guys.
It's such a pleasure to have you here, Alan. And I want to just. I think that we can just break the ice with what we were talking about backstage, because I know that everybody has been thinking about it. I don't think I've ever had so many requests to have people participate on a panel before. I think that everybody wants to ask you questions, and in particular, there's one elephant in the room that I just want to get out of the way so we can have a conversation about many other things. But I wanted to ask you, Alan, in the name of our whole community, what do you think about the possibility, what do you think about the possibility of George Lucas coming back to run Lucasfilm, to lead Star Wars?
I think it would be lovely, because it all started with George, and it would be really nice if it all finished with George. But just speaking personally, I don't think it's likely to happen. Obviously, it's not a question of money. George is comfortably well off, in the same way that, George is comfortably well off. But I think George's principal interest right now is in his museum that he's building in Los Angeles for illustrative art. I think that's a very important endeavor, and I'd really personally like to see him concentrate on that. If he were to take some kind of an off-screen or out-of-the-way executive producer type position with regard to future Star Wars projects, I think that would be charming. But George is not 25 anymore. None of us are 25. At least I'm not 25, and George isn't 25. And no matter what you might want to do, you only have so much energy, and you reach a point in your life where you only have so many functional years left. And I think George really would like to see his museum completed. If he gets to that point to where the museum is finished, he might be interested in taking, again, some kind of an active backstage participation in Star Wars. But I just don't see it happening right now. Sorry.
Okay. No, yeah, that makes a.
Not sorry, depending on your position.
Well, I think we would all love to see George involved in any way, I guess, right? In any way.
Yeah.
Alan, I just wanted to kick things off talking about the musical piece that we listened to in the introduction, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and how you started composing music.
First of all, the way I heard it was pretty distorted. So I don't know if you all heard it really distorted. It's actually written for symphony orchestra, and it kind of sounded like a synth piece, at least the way I heard it. So hopefully the rest of you heard it a little more clearly. Second of all, it's the second movement of a symphonic suite, not the second movement of a symphony. If you do 2-minute movements, you end up with a really short symphony. So it's not a symphony, it's a symphonic suite. Although I am working on my second symphony. I've listened to classical music my whole life. My mother could play Rhapsody in Blue from memory on our piano. I couldn't play anything. When I was 16 years old, I bought some lined paper with musical staves on it and tried to write out some notes of the music that I kept hearing in my head. And after about 4 notes, which took probably 30 minutes, I realized that this was not a project that was going to come to immediate fruition. And I went outside to play basketball with my friends. And many decades passed. And lo and behold, something called music notation software came along, which enables you to write music for any kind of grouping you like, including symphony orchestra. And I thought, without much hope, that I would take a look at it. And lo and behold, music started to appear on the page, and you could hear it played back immediately, and you could make changes very easily, just like with a computer. And it became, for me, I only started doing this in April, very much like learning another language. The writing is different, and the intonations are different, but it's very much like just learning a different language. And I've been having a great deal of fun with it and neglecting other writing for it. But I finished the first movement of my second symphony, real symphony, and I've written several short pieces in another symphony. And the Nightwish Suite is 6 short movements, each one of which is a musical impression of a different member of my favorite band, the Finnish metal band Nightwish. And that's posted on YouTube. People can find those very easily. And so that's what I've been doing musically. I've always been able to hear the music in my head, and I've listened to it for so long that I can tell the difference by listening between, say, an oboe and a bassoon. But prior to discovering the software, I had no idea how I could possibly get any of it written down, much less in a way that anybody else could listen to. So it's been a great deal of fun.
I'm curious, Mr. Foster, if just as someone who is also, I've spent a great deal of my life listening to classical music, if there's any particular work that you are fond of. Like for me, when I think of classical music, Holst's The Planets always comes to mind, as well as Dvorak's Ninth are like 2 of my absolute favorites. So I'm just curious, when you think of a great work of classical music, where do you go?
Havergal Brian's Gothic Symphony.
Ah.
And it's the only time in my life I've ever flown anywhere to attend a concert. And that was in July of 2011 at the Royal Albert Hall in London. Havergal O'Brien's a very interesting character in the history of British music. The Gothic Symphony is in the Guinness Book of Records as requiring the largest orchestral forces of any published piece of music. And for that particular concert, they only did it one night. There were 990 performers on stage, as it were. 4 choirs, 200 musicians, 2 children's choirs, 4 soloists, and 3 offstage, what they call symphonic bands. It's 2 hours long. Brian was self-taught. It's real music. It's not somebody throwing bricks at a piano. And it's like, well, some of it sounds like Vaughan Williams, and some of it sounds like Holst. He was British after all. And then something will come out of the orchestra like nothing you ever heard in your life. There's a very good recording on Hyperion as a CD. And if you go online and you Google Brian Gothic rehearsal and my name, I managed to surreptitiously video about 8 minutes of the final rehearsal before an official came over and said in a very British manner, no video. And you can at least see what the assembled forces looked like and sounded like. So if I had to pick one piece, that would be it. No matter how many times you listen to it, you hear something new. And I also like Dvorak and Holst. And lots of other people.
Wow. And you've written to music, correct, Alan? Do you feel like you've written to music like so many authors say they've done?
Oh, yeah. What do you mean written? Oh, written to music.
Yeah.
No, I can't do that. I know a lot of authors can. I know Arthur Clarke once told me that whenever he had a slow period and he couldn't get started, he'd put on John Williams music from Star Wars, and that always got him going. But I can't do it because I get too involved in the music. As soon as I hear the music, suddenly my brain goes to the music and the orchestra, and how are they doing that? And, how's the orchestration being done? And I forget what I'm supposed to be writing. So the closest I would come to that is I'll hear music in my head, but I can't play music and work at the same time. I just can't do it. It's one reason my wife, Joanne, insisted that I have a separate study, a separate place where I could work, because when we bought this house 40 years ago, it didn't have a separate study. And and I was going to use one of our spare bedrooms, and she said, "No, you can't do that." I said, "Why not? It's a spare room. Nobody's using it." And she said, "I can't play my music loud if you're in here trying to work." And as it turned out, it was a good suggestion for us both.
I want to say thank you to Max World Entertainment. Love me some Alan Dean Foster, says Trey. Thank you, Trey. Absolutely. I wanted to ask you, Alan. Now, do you have any intentions? And obviously, this is very still embryonic for you, maybe, but would you have any intentions that certain compositions that you create be used in conjunction with any film in the future?
I just started doing this in April, so I'm pretty new to all of this, and I'm just learning about things like ornaments and articulations. And if somebody wanted to use some of it or asked me to write some music for something, I'd certainly be willing to give it a shot. If you listen to TV commercials, and how can you not listen to TV commercials? You always hear music. There's a little bit of music. It might be 20 seconds of music, but somebody had to write that. They probably didn't just pull it out of a general public domain file, and that I could certainly do. But to sit down and actually score a film, I don't know if I'm quite ready for that. A short film, maybe, yes, and I can certainly provide background music for something. One thing we wanted to do. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I apologize for the quality of the sound. I do also want people to realize that Alan's composition is intended for an entire orchestra, and so we're not fully appreciating the composition because of the technical sound and because of the context of the music. It's intended for an entire orchestra. Sorry, go ahead, Alan.
That's all right. Yeah, I thought it sounded a little thin and electronic when it's actually written for oboes and flutes and strings and brass, and I don't think that quite came across. At least I didn't hear it that way.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Anybody wants to hear what it really sounds like can go to YouTube and look up the Nightwish videos, which I had to make as videos because Facebook will not let you, YouTube will not let you post just music. It has to be a video. So that's why when you go and look, particularly, Mike, at classical stuff on YouTube, there'll be a shot of the CD cover, and then you'll get 2 hours of music if it's a long piece. There's no real video, but that's the only way you can post music there. So I went ahead and did that for the Nightwish suite, and people can look that up really easily if they want to. But yeah, it would be fun to try putting some music behind something. The first thing I ever wrote was called Prelude to the Commonwealth, the Commonwealth being a long-running series of books of mine, and talked to my agent about maybe talking to the publisher for the next Commonwealth book, include a little URL where people could go and listen to the prelude before they started the book. So I love this kind of mixing media, but I'm not really in a position to do it just by myself. I could play some music here just by turning it on my computer, but I think we probably should get to probably should do questions at this point. People can look up some of the music if they want to. Yeah,
and I've listened to a lot of it, Alan. Thank you so much for sharing that. And there are little short segments that I think are just awesome, and they could be used in conjunction with other media. So fascinating ideas, and we will put links links under the video that will take people to that music. And I want to I just want to welcome author Dr. Adega Outlaw, who by some mishap had not gotten the link. I apologize, Adega. Welcome.
Oh, it's not
Hello.
a problem. It's not a problem, actually. It's an honor to be here with everybody. And Alan, thank you for your time. I know you've been here before. I know you go on a lot of these shows, and you probably answer all these questions over and over again. But you got a lot of fans, and we all appreciate it.
Indeed.
It's my pleasure. I got to ask you a question. Up on your top shelf behind your head, is that a reproduction from the bad guy's weapon from the last Starfighter? Or is that a different kind of mace?
No, that's just one of those ones you get from one of those cheap weapons factories.
Okay.
It's not anything exciting. I keep my good stuff hidden.
Okay. I don't care anymore.
I really don't too much either, but somehow things just appear. But that's kind of cool that you notice. You got a keen eye.
Oh well, it's my job. You get to a point in life where suddenly the only thing that rings in your head, besides music occasionally, is George Carlin's routine on Stuff, and it reaches a point to where it's just stuff. It'd be
Right.
nice as it, but it's just stuff. So
Right.
And just so you know, Alan, Adega is a friend, a prominent member in our community who is a doctor of chiropractic medicine who has become a science fiction author. So that's
yeah,
one of
we're all over the place.
Yeah, well, you know what? I'm just here to pick your brain. I'm not here to tote any horns of anybody else. You're the man of the hour or 2 hours or however long PJ decides to keep you handcuffed to the microphone.
Well, Alan, I wanted to. I also wanted to ask you a little bit about traveling because you mentioned how traveling was a passion, and maybe if if things would have been different, maybe you would have traveled a whole bunch, but you still traveled a lot.
1 second, gentlemen. Please
Yep.
mute me.
I will mute you.
Spam phone call. Never mind.
I got those.
Okay. Yeah, we all get those. So, Alan, you've gotten the chance to travel a lot, and I want to put up one of our favorite pictures of you, about some of your travels. Where have you been in your life, and where are you most? What has touched you the most? The places where you have traveled, and about your love of wildlife and cultures and in general. What have you most loved about traveling?
Okay, quick preface. When I started writing science fiction or even reading science fiction, and I got a chance to go to a science fiction convention, the first one was Baycon in Berkeley, California, 1969. I thought these guys and gals, that's what they did was travel, to experience other cultures and live in other ecologies to inform their own writing. And when I found out that most of them didn't go anywhere and they did all their research from National Geographic and Science Magazine, I was kind of crushed because I didn't understand how you could do that. And that's all I ever wanted to do. Blame Karl Barks and Uncle Scrooge if you want, because Scrooge was always traveling around the world, but that's all I wanted to see. But as far as beautiful places, different places have different things. If you want animals, you go to South America and Africa. If you want culture, you go to Europe or Japan. If you want excitement, there are still a few places on the planet that don't have Starbucks and McDonald's. And you go to some place like the interior of Papua New Guinea or Gabon. And every place features different things. And I love going by myself, although I enjoyed my wife going with me when she could earlier. She hasn't been able to for many years. And once in a great while, I would go with someone. I've taken trips with the artists Ron Wolotsky and James Gurney. And that's fun if it's just one person. But you never go with a group. If you go with a group, you end up talking to nobody except the people in the group. And then you get back on the bus and you talk to the people in the group. And I know why people do it. They're afraid, or they don't have very much time to see a lot of places. But my favorite way of traveling is to go by myself and experience and just become part of the area. If you learn a little bit of the language and you learn something of the customs before you go, it becomes a lot easier. That picture was taken by Michael Medford, who's a photographer for National Geographic and other magazines, on Imbuzi Island in the French Comoros Islands, which is the answer to one of my favorite trivia questions, which is where in the world do lemurs live in the wild besides Madagascar? And I think even Jeopardy might get this wrong. But whether they got there by themselves or were moved hundreds of years ago, the Mayotte brown lemur lives in the wild on the islands of the French Comoros. There's one island that has been set aside, although they're all over the place in the islands. There's one island that's been set aside as a preserve for them, and they've become very acclimated to the presence of people. And as soon as your little boat shows up with some people on it, they're all over you. And like any other lemur, they're just as cute as all get out. One of them was fascinated by my earring and kept trying to get my earring. But he was very gentle. But of course, they have very human-like hands with prehensile thumbs. And, it's not an alien, but it's a pretty close picture, I guess.
How did the contrasting cultures, that experiencing all those contrasting cultures, like you were mentioning before, I mean, how does that help a writer when they're coming up, when they're inventing a culture?
Well, for me, sometimes you'll get an entire book or an entire story out of going someplace. My wife and I managed to go visit with a friend in Tanzania in 1983, when it was kind of a difficult time to get around Tanzania. It was basically a communist government. Things were falling apart. But my friend was working for the Danish Foreign Aid Agency, and he was living there, he and his wife. And we spent a month driving around Tanzania and saw practically nothing in the way of other tourists. Before we left, I had outlined a fantasy book that I thought I would write based on the cultures and history of East Africa. And the things that I saw and the experiences that we had while I was there were completely different from what I expected in many respects. And when we got home, I threw the outline away and wrote a completely different book. Into the Out Of is the name of the book. And so there's one direct way that it influences you. Another book called Interlopers starts in Peru, which I visited a couple of times, and moves to Australia. And all of these places in the book that are outside the U.S. are places that I've actually visited. And so when I'm describing something like the ecology or an urban environment or the people, I've actually experienced that. I've actually seen it. When I'm writing something far in the future, where obviously I have unfortunately not been able to visit in person, although my wife might disagree with that, I take these bits and pieces of things that I've seen in places that I've been, and I can transform them and morph them, and they become otherworldly. And it makes it very easy in that respect. Sometimes something that I've done or seen leads to something completely different. I've always been interested in geology. When I was a kid, very small, I had a very nice rock collection. As I got older, it got bigger. And then it became a battle for space in my living place between books and rocks, and the rocks had to go. But many years later, I wrote a book called Sense to Prism, which is set on a planet where most of the life forms, not all, but most are based on silicon. A lot of that came from my rock collection from when I was a kid. So you never know where your source of inspiration is going to come from.
Yeah, wow. Anti-Tracker, do you want to go ahead and ask Alan a question?
Well, it's. I'll be honest with you. I don't generally get like starstruck or anything in the celebrities that I've talked to, but talking to you is just. It makes me feel like I'm a little kid again because you are instrumental in my two favorite science fiction franchises of all time, Star Trek and Star Wars. The first Star Wars book I ever read was yours, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and I had copies of the Star Trek logs 1 through 10 that I literally wore the covers off of reading over and over and over when I was young. So first and foremost, I just want to say thank you for the body of work that you've done and how much it's influenced me, and I know so many others, not just in this country, but around the world. So thank you so much for what you've done. But I'm curious, I'm genuinely curious about, since you're credited as with the story of Star Trek The Motion Picture, so I'm very curious as to the genesis of that story. Where did it come from? How was it originally written compared to what we actually got on screen? And what are your thoughts of the film as it was released?
Well, some of this has been written about elsewhere and probably will continue to be written about in the future. But what happened was my wife and I were living in Big Bear Lake, California, which is about an hour and a half's drive out of downtown Los Angeles. And I got a call from my agent one day. She said that they're going to revive Star Trek as a TV series, and they're soliciting story ideas, treatments, from various writers, and they would like you to contribute some with a possible eye towards production, assuming that the TV series is indeed picked up. So I went down to Norway Productions, which was Gene Roddenberry's production company on Paramount Lot, and met with him and a couple of other people, and went home and wrote 3 treatments. And for one of them, Roddenberry had given me a 2-page typed outline for a story called Robots Return. And he said, see if you can make something of this. So I took it and did my best to make something of it, and came back with 3 treatments for 3 one-hour episodes. At this point, seismic movements were occurring in the Star Trek professional universe, and it was decided that no, we're not going to revive the TV series. We're going to make a major motion picture of Star Trek. All due, certainly, I'm sure, to the success of Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind in the theater. At this point, they're still talking about, though, at Norway, reviving the show as a TV series, because talk of a motion picture had been going back and forth for many years. And they decided that they wanted to open the revived series with a 2-hour movie for television. So they looked around for a story which they felt could support 2 hours instead of 1. And my treatment, which I called In Thy Image, was picked. I was asked to go back and expand the treatment to carry 2 hours instead of 1 hour. I did that, I turned it in, and then suddenly the word came down, we're definitely doing a motion picture. What I think happened, and I was not privy to any of these discussions, was that the people at Norway had been twisted around so many times, TV series, movie, with nothing happening, that somebody said, look, let's give them something quick before they change their mind again, them being those in charge of Paramount and, more importantly, financing. And here was my treatment, lo and behold, designed to run for almost 2 hours. So they gave them that, and as I recall reading about it, because I wasn't there, they had a big meeting, and Michael Eisner, who was then head at Paramount, held up the treatment and said, this is our movie. Now, I'm not anywhere around while any of this is happening, remember. And it became the basis for a movie, at which point I became an instant non-person at Paramount and Norway Productions, because now suddenly it's not a TV episode, it's a big budget motion picture. There's a lot of money and a lot of ego involved. I'm just a young writer, I had no pull in the business, and I knew how the business worked. My uncle was a very well-known producer in television. So I went back home to Big Bear and went back to writing my books and said, well, that's just the way it goes. And eventually, the movie came out. There's a lot of other things I could say about it, but it's all basically written down, and there are forthcoming books which will go into it in somewhat more detail. And I finally got to see the picture. I did not go to the premiere at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. We were invited. Paramount was going to pay for the limo and the plane and everything else. But for one particular reason, we didn't go, and that reason is common knowledge. And, yeah, there we go. And I saw the film, and I thought, very nice film, great music, acting's good. The V'ger ship is not quite the way I envisioned it, but it looks great. I knew nothing at this point, of course, of the problems with getting the special effects done and getting everything edited together. I did think there were some sequences that went on too long, but as you watch this, even for the first time, you realize that this is an editing problem. And again, I knew nothing of what was happening behind the scenes. But I enjoyed the film, and I do know that if you went to a major Hollywood studio today and said, I'd like to make a film about the next step up in human evolution, they would laugh you out of the room. Mm-hmm. So in that respect, I think it was great. I mean, people, if you just want to shoot them up, and I like shoot them up as much as the next person, it's very difficult to get a film done. I've seen 2 really good science fiction films in the last few years. Neither of them were shoot 'em ups. although they both had some action. And one was called Arrival. The other one was called Annihilation. Both of which, lo and behold, are based on stories by actual writers of science fiction. And this possibility constantly seems to be escaping the people who run the big studios. So, but those of us who are fans, we know. And now we're getting, I think it's Apple TV or Amazon, I'm not sure which one. I think Apple is doing the Foundation trilogy. And I can't wait to see what they do with that. There are going to have to be some changes made. It wasn't written as a screenplay, obviously. I'm looking forward to that very much. So that was the story of my involvement with Star Trek the Motion Picture. I was never asked to work on the screenplay. I would have been happy to make suggestions for no charge because I'm as much a fan as I am a writer. But they look at you kind of funny sideways in Hollywood if you offer to do something for nothing. So
I have a question and kind of a follow-up to that. And I know that writing the story treatment is very different than writing a screenplay. But there's one particular line in that film that has always stuck with me as a part of philosophical debate. And I was always wondering if that line came from you or from Harold Livingston, because I know that the original story treatment was called In Thy Image, and it just seemed to be like that would be the reason for that title. And that was when they're looking at the V'ger probe, and Decker says, "We all create God in our own image." I love that line because it's very true, regardless of, I know there are a lot of differing beliefs in the world, but we all tend to identify with a deity that reflects ourselves. And I'm curious if that line came from you or if it came from Mr. Livingston.
Generally, there's no dialogue in a treatment.
Right.
So it came from Mr. Livingston, but obviously was inspired by the whole story and the title.
Right.
But I did not write the line, no.
Really? You didn't like that line?
No, I say I didn't write.
Oh, okay. I thought you said you didn't like it. I was like...
No. It's a fine line. I didn't write the line. I didn't write any of the dialogue. I'm responsible. The first 5 minutes of that film, I wrote.
The Klingon introduction?
Yes, I can look at that and say, okay, that's directly taken from my treatment. I was responsible.
I don't mean to cut you off, sir, but that is like one of my absolute favorite action sequences in all of Trek. I love that first of all, I know this wasn't you, but the music was perfect. That Klingon theme that they created there was absolutely perfect. And just the grandiose nature of the shot, the way that the camera moved around the three ships and everything about that sequence, I truly loved. And
Agreed.
That was like, when I was 11 years old watching that, I was like, oh my God, Star Trek is on the big screen. And so...
Well, that's what I wanted. That's what everybody wanted. But,
right.
And it would have been very easy. I'm frankly surprised that they picked my treatment as the basis for the film, even though it was the only one set up to do 2 hours, because it's basically a philosophical film. You have a lot of action at the beginning, and then there's a lot of talk and discussion. And, I thought it was real Star Trek. That's what I wanted to do. That's what I did when I expanded the animated series into the Star Trek logbooks. I got to write some of my own Star Trek. That's what I did when I wrote these little short radio plays, not radio plays, but for talking records, for Peter Pan Records, where I did get to write dialogue for the characters, was to do real Star Trek. And there's plenty of, and Lord knows I've written enough space opera myself, there's plenty of space opera out there, but where people sit around and think about things. And you have to have some kind of action, because if you just show people thinking, you've got a 1950s black and white French film with people sitting on a train smoking cigarettes and not saying anything. But there are ways to work it in there without doing long periods of exposition. And that's what I tried to do in the treatment for the film, and that's what I tried to do on occasion when doing the Star Trek vlogs. But I love doing action too, as you can tell from the first 5 minutes of the film.
I wanted to ask, just follow up, Alan, more specifically to the melding with Ilea and Decker. How did you come about that idea of becoming one with the creator?
That was originally supposed to be Spock, not Decker,
Oh.
because it made perfectly logical sense. You see that throughout the film. Spock's the one who's really intrigued, potential dangers aside, with what kind of a mind, an alien mind, they're dealing with here. And I wrote it originally to be Spock and Decker, but they changed it. I mean, excuse me, Spock and Aaliyah. But for obvious reasons, they changed it because people were already thinking sequels. And if the film had done that, there'd be, hey presto, no more Spock. But it's just, we're along that road. We're moving along that road where you have human and machines melding. I put that in my treatment that nobody saw for episode 8 of Star Wars, which was my way of rationalizing how Rey, to make a big jump here for a second, how Rey suddenly has the ability to do all these fantastical things without lots of training, and maybe things that you can do even without Jedi training. And so it's all there in the treatment, which Disney wouldn't look at, but that's the business. And it's like, hey, she had an operation, which was the only way to save her life because she had a fatal disease, and she becomes essentially part cyborg. And I've always been fascinated by this idea. I mean, personally, I couldn't wait until I could get a few machine parts. Go down to the local bio garage and pick up a few things that would let me write music a little better. And probably everybody has thought about that.
George, can you draw a Borg version of Alan at some point?
That'd be interesting.
Sorry.
So I don't want to monopolize all the time, and I'll shut up after this. But like I said, this is one of those few times that I truly get starstruck getting to talk to someone who I truly idolized when I was young. And there's one other work of yours that was seminal to me. I still have it in mint condition in my other room. It's in storage, and that is, in fact, the book record set for Passage to Moab, or however you say that. I can never remember.
Oh, you got it.
And so and it was such a different kind of story, and that's something I liked about Star Trek in the post-original series, but pre-films. It really went into some interesting experimental areas, like in the animated series and some of those comics and stuff. So what gave you the idea of I don't remember what the creature was called, but how it was generating all that sound that was driving everybody crazy? What gave you the idea for that?
I love writing aliens. I really do. And I love, again, this is from travel to a certain extent. Different cultures give you different points of view. I got a lot of this from Robert Sheckley, who I think was the greatest science fiction short story writer the field's ever produced. Sheckley was great at portraying alien points of view. And the idea that there could be other ways for creatures to defend themselves, and you actually see this to a certain extent in the Star Trek TV series. But I was trying to think of something where you have a creature which is harmless, appears harmless, and actually has a way of defending itself that isn't designed to hurt anybody. It's just designed to defend itself. And it ends up on the Enterprise, and then you have that story, which is nice that it's on Peter Pan Records because you have sound effects that you can do. You can't do sound effects too well on paper. And that was the basic idea. We're talking back in the Jurassic now, so I don't remember all the details exactly. But that was just it. They have this problem on the ship. They don't know what's going on. It's getting worse and worse. And it all tends to stem from something that looks like somebody's pet cat, essentially. Mm-hmm. But you don't realize that at first. And again, if you travel and you see creatures in the rainforest and in the jungle and in the desert, and they look perfectly harmless, and they're not, because you assume when you're walking through the rainforest that everything either stings or bites. That's the safe way to do it, and those are the basic ideas behind that particular story, as I remember it.
Well, you guys better jump in, or else I'm going to hog the whole thing. So, what?
Elaine, you got anything to contribute, or Bird of Prey, or Dega, or just fire away.
Well, I just wanted to say I loved your thoughts on the philosophical aspect of science fiction. I really think that's what the heart of science fiction is, to ask questions, pose questions. And those are my favorite parts of science fiction, or even science fiction films, is the quiet moments that, we get to know our characters in that way. So I think that's awesome, that you agree. And Star Trek, the original motion picture, does that really well. I think it's not the shoot 'em ups. It's not. I mean, I like a little action too, but I think the real meat of the story should be you posing those questions and the philosophical aspect of it. I think that's what really ties it all together. So that's really cool. I think that movie does it really well.
The trick with that, whether it's in written form or in film form, is not to lose your audience. And when you start you don't want to start a philosophical discussion necessarily. You want to integrate it into the storyline while other things are happening, so that people will not skip a chapter or go out to get popcorn. And you do that with suspense, or you do it with interesting characters, or you do it with background action. But I always try to do that. A lot of my original fiction, or a good deal of it, involves talking about ecology and how important it is that everything is interconnected, everything on this planet is interconnected. But you don't sit down and do that. You don't say, now, dear reader, I'm going to talk about how everything on the planet is interconnected. You make it part of the story. It's actually easier to do in print than it is in film. But you can do it in film too. Annihilation does that. The film version of Annihilation does that very well by exploring what happens when evolution goes a little berserk. But you don't have one of the characters say, well, now evolution's going to go berserk, and we're going to show you examples. You make it part of the flow of the story.
That's so true. And Jet Screamer brings out about Dune, if you're looking forward to that. And that's definitely a film or a book it's a lot of setting up the story, a lot of world building, and there's not a lot of action. There's maybe like a couple of scenes, but it's so well done, so part of the story, that people are wondering if that can translate well into film. So what do you think about this new adaptation? You looking forward to it?
I'm looking forward to any film that declares itself to be science fiction. I don't care if it's from Bulgaria or from Hollywood. We see little enough of it that's actually science fiction. So, of course, I'm looking forward to it. And, of course, the director of this new version of Dune is Denis Villeneuve, who directed Arrival. So that really got me interested right away. And we will see what happens. The book is exactly like what you said. It's very dense, it's very complex. And to cut all that down for a 2 or 2.5 hour film is going to be difficult. David Lynch tried, the studio messed with it, and it's still a good film, I think. Hopefully this one will be better, but sure, I'm looking forward to it.
Did you happen to any thoughts on Ad Astra? I was wondering, because I thought that was an interesting philosophical sci-fi film recently.
I've got it on my viewing list. It's on the recorder. Nobody gets out much these days, but you got out then. And I'm definitely going to watch it. You can do good science fiction without spending $100 million. A couple of examples are Moon.
Moon was great.
I mean, very, very small, very constricted, but good direction and good camera work, constantly moving around, even though you're basically in a tight spot, shows what you can do. And again, the philosophical idea behind that. Her, another good film done on a low budget. There actually are there's practically no science fiction element in that film. It's an excellent film. My favorite example would have to be Dark City. And imagine trying to make a science fiction film. Alex Proyas was the director of that, I believe. Trying to make a science fiction film today and get William Hurt, Jennifer Connelly, and Kiefer Sutherland to star in it. I mean, that was just a remarkable confluence of elements to come together for a real science fiction film. Reminded me a lot of a famous science fiction book called Lords of the Psychon by Dennis Galway, a very little-known writer today, unfortunately. But just a terrific real science fiction film. Roger Ebert, who I think was the only major film critic in the United States who actually read science fiction, put that on his 10 best films of the year list. So
yeah,
it can
he
be
actually
done.
he did a full length commentary track on the DVD release of the film, and it's really interesting to listen to Roger Ebert's take on every scene of that film.
I haven't seen that. I've got to look at that,
Yeah.
because Ebert understood science fiction because he read it. And a lot of film critics, they know science fiction only from seeing science fiction films. And that's kind of like painting with only one color.
I want to say thank you to Jet Screamer for the Dune comment. And George, do you have a question for Alan?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Hi, Alan. Great to see you again.
Hey.
Good to talk to you again. And I'm really fascinated about the music element that you've included in your life right now. What is your favorite instrument? And as you create composition, you know, what brings you to that moment? Is it a narrative in your head? Just, you know, it's a wide open question, I know, but I'm really fascinated because what you have inspired in me is that if I could create my own comic books, which I do, and do my own writing and in a way in scripting, if I can create my own music that flows with the stuff that I write, wow! And what you're doing, I fell in love with your work when I read Star Wars. You're now the Star Wars novel, and I never looked back. I used it as my Bible, and this thing adding music to your work, to your talent stack, to your talent skill. You're blowing my mind.
Well, it's something I always wanted to. Music has always been there in my head, like I said, from age 16. I just had no way of getting it down on paper. And when I hear it in my head, I hear it fully orchestrated. I don't just hear a tune. This probably is because I can't play an instrument. So I don't hear it as played for the piano or electric guitar or anything like that. I hear it as played for an orchestra. I don't have a favorite instrument. If I had to pick one, it would probably be the pipe organ because it sounds the most like a full orchestra. When I was a little kid, my mother tried to give me piano lessons. And I did a few, and after about 3, I found out I couldn't play Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto. It would need more work. And I dropped it. I kind of wish now I hadn't, but I did. And I begged my parents for a drum set. Well, we didn't have an estate. And for reasons that I sort of understood at the time, they wouldn't buy me a drum set. And my next choice was the organ, and there were no electric organs for anything resembling a reasonable price at that time. And that was the end of my experimenting with playing music at the time, let alone composing it. I play a little didgeridoo. There's not a lot of demand for that at the New York Phil. And I've played a little taiko, which are the big Japanese drums. And I love that, but I wouldn't write necessarily music for it. It's fun physically, provided you don't have a heart attack. But there's that. But as far as favorite instrument, I would pick the pipe organ for the reason I mentioned. And when I sit down to write music now, I'll hear a little something, and I'll hear a theme in my head, or I'll hear a melody. And I'll write that down, and I'll try to sound it for the instrument that I think sounds best with. And then I'll do counterpoint in a different instrument or set of instruments in the orchestra and try to blend them together. And it's very much like writing a novel. Authors will tell you that the best moment when you're writing a novel is when the characters take over. It's when a character will start to do something that you hadn't planned out in your head or plotted out in advance. It's the same thing, I think, with writing music. You'll start writing something, and then it'll occur to you, well, it would be really cool if you brought the strings in right here and did them staccato, and that's how things happen. Then you go back and revise, just like with a book. You go back and say, well, the strings don't really work here, or the violins don't work. What if I do it for the cello? I mean, there's a piece in the Nightwish Suite. One of the impressions they have, one of their 6 members is an Irish gentleman named Troy Donockley, and he plays like 6 different instruments and sings. And so one of the instruments he plays is the Uilleann pipes, if I'm saying that correctly. It's the Irish bagpipes, very different from the bagpipes we're generally familiar with. And I couldn't find a sound font. There are sound fonts, just like word fonts, in my software that I was using for the Uilleann pipes, which is hardly surprising. But there are a couple of measures in the short piece for Troy, which combine strings and bagpipe. You don't generally hear that when you go to a symphony concert. That was just a lot of fun. It gives it a really interesting sound. I love playing around with stuff like that. I mean, couldn't you imagine yourself being at a symphony concert and suddenly about 5 minutes into it, one of the percussionists gets up in the back and picks up a bagpipe, and the whole audience would freak. They don't know what they're going to They have no idea what they're going to hear. And it's just background. It's very soft, but it gives an interesting tonality to that particular bit of music.
I want to follow up with that. I'm curious. What software are you using, and what led you to that software? Because I'm assuming there's like hundreds of software out there that could help you create your mind's eye.
Well, the major ones are software like Sibelius and I forget the others, but there are three major ones. But remember, I was just starting this. I didn't know if it would go anywhere, if I could do anything with it. There's a free software called MuseScore, MuseScore. It's free. It's open source and it's free. It's pretty good. The sound font is pretty good. Now, if I wanted my music to sound more like a real symphony orchestra, and the MuseScore sound font is pretty good, you can buy sound fonts that you can inject your music into. The Vienna Philharmonic has a sound font, but I think it's 12 grand. So I wasn't quite ready to buy that at the start. I'm not sure I'm ever going to be quite ready to buy. What I'd really like, of course, since even MuseScore allows you to print out parts for all the instruments, is to have a real orchestra play the music, and then it would be able to hear it properly. But the sound font that goes with it is pretty good. The strings are good, the woodwinds are good, the brass is a little off in places, but it's way better than, plunking it out on a piano, let's say. So you can go to the MuseScore site, musescore.org, and you can download the software for free, and you can play around with it. And it doesn't have to be symphony orchestra. They'll let you do what they call classical orchestra. If you just want to write for guitar, you can do that, or piano, you can do that. If you want to write a cappella choirs, you can do that. It's very versatile, and for free software, I think it's excellent. It certainly has worked well for me.
You brought
That
up
is
something.
fascinating. Go ahead, Diego.
Jump in if you don't mind. You brought up something, and I wanted to. It was a question that I was having in my mind because I'm new to this whole author thing, and people, they say this or that about writing, and I wanted to go to the man himself. A lot of people, and you've mentioned that you do outlines. You get ideas from various different sources. And when you have that in your head, and then you just mentioned with George that when things start coming out, the characters take their own life. How close do you come to your original outline when you start writing? Do these characters start diverting you on a whole new road? Does it end up where you originally wanted to be, or does it just depend on which story you're telling?
Of course, every writer is different. I don't
Right.
really do extensive outlines anymore. I used to do a 20-page outline before I started a book, but I've done this long enough to where I can get away with a 2-page outline. And I'll write that, and then I'll go back and revise, and then I'll start writing the book or the story. And I know I'm going to get to the end because I have the end in mind at the beginning. It very rarely changes. On occasion, it has. But what changes throughout the book, and you mentioned about characters taking over, is you'll kind of want a character to do something because that's where you've outlined it. But by the time you get to, say, chapter 3, the character has been developed to the point to where the character wouldn't do what you originally outlined it to do. And you have no choice. You, as the author, have to follow what the character wants to do. It's kind of like owning a cat. And it's a beautiful thing because it always works. It's always better to go with what the character wants to do than to force the character into the outline you've already written. What you do is you go and you change the outline
Right.
to
Right.
reflect what the character wants to do. You have to be open to that. When you start with your characters, you start with a generalized idea of the plot, and you start presumably with a beginning and an end. And if it changes throughout, well, that's just a wonderful thing. It's the difference between taking a cross-country trip strictly on interstates and getting off the interstate and going around on state highways and small roads.
I just
I
want to
found
say,
that with what I've done, and I just, I'm always curious because, like I said, I'm just an amateur, and I'm looking at someone, I looked at your library and all the things that you've done, and it's just fascinating how the writer mind, because I've heard it from other people too, will follow the lead of the right brain, even though it's not consciously in your mind. It just, the character is now alive somewhere inside that melon, and it tells you where to go. But thank you for bringing that. I appreciate that.
What I do when I'm writing is there's a little screen about 8 inches in front of my face, and I describe it's in my head, but I describe what I'm seeing. This probably comes from learning how to read from reading comic books. So I've been called a visual writer, and it's because I'm describing what I'm seeing. And if you look at it that way, even action sequences become fairly easy to do. The harder ones are the ones like Elaine mentioned, where you're dealing with philosophy or characters' thoughts and you're inside the character's head. And that's where you really get to know the character. You don't get to know the character because the character picks up a gun and goes out to shoot some alien that's threatening your colony. You do it by being inside the character's head and showing on paper what he is thinking while he's going to do this thing. In film, that's very difficult to do. It's very tough to bring off. Lynch's version of Dune, for example, tries to do it with Muad'Dib
Right.
when he's under the influence of the spice. It doesn't really work visually. I mean, you're looking at print, and that's not what you do. It's a different medium. It has to be done visually.
I just want to say thank you to Tyrone. Tyrone from Australia, down under, says, a great honor, sir. I recently bought a van to travel Australia and was going to call it Voyager, but I called it V'ger, where the mud kicks up from the tires to cover the omitted OYA at the back. Okay, that's great,
That's
Tyrone.
awesome.
It's amazing.
Be sure, Tyron, to get to the Kimberley, and if you can make it over to the Bungles, that's a terrific place to have a van. Can't take it. Well, I could go on and on about that, but you're going, you know where you're driving, so there's just 2 recommendations there. But you can't drive the Rowley Shoals, which is a problem. So,
What do you tell us about your experience in Australia, Alan? What do you know about it? Have you been there often?
I think we were there briefly on our honeymoon. We flew in from Bali to Melbourne and immediately had to find a used clothing store where we could buy coats because it was cold and raining in Melbourne, and it wasn't cold and raining in Bali. But my wife and I have driven up about half the East Coast from Brisbane to where the pavement ended. At that time, it didn't go nearly as far as it does now. And I was on a diving expedition with Rodney Fox back in 1991. Rodney Fox is the world's most famous great white shark attack survivor and a man responsible for taking out crews to film great white sharks for National Geographic and Discovery Channel and
Oh, wow.
and Jaws. Tells a very funny story about the second unit crew filming live action footage for Jaws. And Rodney and I hit it off very well. That's the only video footage I've ever sold. It was used by the BBC, but there's much better footage of great whites now. We know a lot more about them, and 4K is a lot better than 8mm, which is what I was shooting at the time. If any historians remember what that was. And Rodney had then done a 2-part, 2 articles for National Geographic on Northwest Australia. Wanted to repeat the trip without having any responsibilities, asked if I would like to come along, and it was kind of an old grungy boat, but it was serviceable. So we went up the northwest coast of Australia from Exmouth to Kings River, stopping at unknown Aboriginal painting sites along the way and an abandoned resort, and out to Rowley Shoals, which has the clearest water I've ever seen. These are 3 shoals way offshore from Australia. And it was just a wonderful trip. And I've been in Sydney several times. One of my favorite artists' homes is a National Trust, as they call it, outside of Sydney. Norman Lindsay, great artist who influenced Frazetta and Roy Krenkel and a lot of other fantasy artists that are much better known in the United States. It's a very interesting film called Sirens, Sirens, which was made about a true incident in Lindsay's life. Stars Hugh Grant and Sam Neill from Jurassic Park, and most of it was shot at Lindsay's home and property, outside, about 3 hours drive outside of Sydney. And you also get to see Elle Macpherson in the buff, which is kind of nice, but that's who Lindsay was. It's basically a film about censorship and how it affects people. And Hugh Grant plays a priest who was sent to get Lindsay to try and withdraw one of his very controversial pen and ink drawings from a major art show in Sydney. This is in the 1920s or 30s, as I recall. And all of the other artists in the show said that if they made Lindsay pull his drawing, they were all going to withdraw from the show. So this priest was sent up to try and get Lindsay to withdraw it on his own. Sam Neill plays Lindsay. Hugh Grant plays the priest. Interesting film.
Wow.
So I have a
Bird,
question.
go ahead. Yeah.
It's a little bit more maybe on the practical side, but when it comes to novelizing movies like the many you've done, let's say Star Trek 2009 or Into Darkness, I'm wondering, in the process, are there notes or interviews you do with the writers? Is there anything that comes from the original team, or is this basically you got carte blanche and write what you want for details that aren't in the movie?
Right. It depends how involved the studio wants to get. You never talk to the original writers, which I think is a good thing, both for you and for them.
Mm-hmm.
You got to remember, for the studio, this is an ancillary right. Novelization's not a big deal. This is a spin-off for the studio. Sometimes they leave you completely alone, which is what you want as a writer. When I did the novelization of Star Wars, it was a 2-book contract for Star Wars and a sequel novel, Splinter of the Mind's Eye. And it was basically, go write the books. So I wrote Star Wars, brought it in. We had a meeting. George had rented offices at Universal at that time. Myself, George, Gary Kurtz, the producer, Charlie Lippincott, who was in charge of promotion, PR. And eventually got around to the book, and George said, you did a good job. That was it. That was the extent of the commentary on the novelization. You love that. But as time moves on and suddenly the internet comes along and every fan knows everything, including the design of the belt buckle of a major character, studios get more involved with things because they realize this may become a strange thing called canon. And so they get very, very picky. And when I did the novelization of The Force Awakens, suddenly there's now a Star Wars group that supervises all these things. And they went over everything with a fine-tooth comb, made me take out a bunch of stuff. Some of it I said okay, some of it I argued for, that didn't matter. Some of it I thought they would take out, they left alone, which was wonderful. Usually the studio leaves you alone. I would get, most of the time, I'd get some pre-production stills, some pre-production art, the screenplay, of course, which you must have, and that would be about it. And you'd write the book based on those things. You wouldn't talk to anybody. And then you would turn in the manuscript and they'd say, yeah, we like it. Can you maybe change this little bit or that little bit? The only time I had a really bad experience with that was with the novelization of Alien 3. I've done the novelizations of Alien and Aliens. Everybody seemed real happy with those. I wasn't real happy with Warner for taking out all the swear words from Aliens. You had Space Marines saying things like "gosh golly." Didn't find out about that interestingly until a fan wrote me and asked why I did that, and I was kind of like, "Huh?" And I went and looked at the book I had. I'd never opened any of my copies, and sure enough, all the cuss words were taken out. It had been Bowdlerized, and I wrote the company. I was really, really incensed, more for Cameron because it was his original dialogue than for me. And why'd you do this? And I got this rather strange apologetic letter back saying, well, somebody, they wouldn't name who it was, at Warner Books, thought that it would make for a more accessible book for teenagers. Like, teenagers don't know any swear words.
Yeah, they can't read about them.
That was it. But Alien 3, which I did not think was a good screenplay, which is basically 95% of what I'm working with, I didn't think it was very good. I was really proud of my work on Alien and Aliens. I thought they were both great films. I wanted to do right by those films with the book version of Alien 3. So I added a lot of stuff. You have all these people on this prison planet. Why are they there? What did they do? What are they really like? Getting inside characters' heads again. I thought the killing of Newt and, gosh, so many names to remember. The other guy.
Hicks.
Thank you.
Hicks.
Yes, and Hicks at the beginning, I thought that was stupid from a story standpoint, and I thought it was obscene as far as the little girl was concerned. There was an autopsy scene with her in the film. And I just thought, this is bad. This is like a graduate film student trying to shock his audience and showing off. And so I fixed that in a way that still let them be in the story, but basically their capsules were damaged, so they were there, but they couldn't be opened. So they were present and they were alive, but they were not part of the story. That's how I fixed that, or tried to anyway. And I did that throughout the book and turned it in. I forgot about it. Lord, hang on a second. And
I muted you. Oh, okay.
okay, and got a letter back from Walter Hill, who was one of the producers, much better known for, I think, for Beverly Hills Cop, which was a much better film, saying, you can't do this. You need to follow the script exactly. We think it will make for a much better book. So instead of being snarky and writing back and saying, well, I've been doing this sort of thing for a while, and it was okay with George Lucas and James Cameron and Ray Harryhausen and John Carpenter, and I kind of know what I'm doing here. You can't do that because it's a work for hire. You don't own any of it. So I took out a great deal of what I had invented for the book. And I think it became much blander and less interesting, and that's the book that was eventually published. Then they came to me later and asked me to do the novelization of Alien Resurrection, and I said no. And I forgot all about Alien for a very long time. And the gal who did end up doing Alien Resurrection, the novelization, A.C. Crispin, got a letter from her not long thereafter, and all it said was, Alan, why didn't you tell me? And of course, many years went by, and then they asked me to do the novelization of Alien Covenant. And my initial reaction was, no, I'm done with this franchise. And they came back and said, nobody who was involved with Alien 3 is involved with this picture.
Magic words.
Yes. Ridley Scott is back doing the picture, and I thought, okay, whole different situation. So I ended up doing the novelization of Alien Covenant, and then this is kind of amusing. They asked me to do a sequel novel to that film, and then they changed their minds and asked me to do a prequel novel. And I thought, well, that could be really fun. I can talk about what happens between, what happens after Alien Covenant. Excuse me, that was going to be the sequel novel. And then the prequel novel, they said, no, we're going to do a prequel novel. And I was kind of like, nah, prequels are really hard to write because you know what's going to happen after the prequel. But I agreed. I said, are there any restrictions or anything you want me to do, not do? And they said, do anything you want, you just can't use the alien. You want me to write an alien book in which the alien does not appear? Yep. So that's why some people like that book.
Wow.
and some people didn't. And for those of you who didn't and wondered where the alien was, he's floating around somewhere in a department at 20th Century Fox, because I wasn't allowed to use him. That was a tough job. I did the best I could, but it was basically inventing an awful lot of stuff. And I would do things like, Adega, you were talking about what do you add and how do you add it. The company in all of the Alien films is called, come on, Mike, you're the source on this. Stuff.
Wayland, Wayland, and then there's an
Yutani.
Yutani.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the book deals with Mr. Yutani. We have the other guy, but nobody knows anything about Yutani. So I invented this whole backstory for Yutani and how he got involved with you have to read the book. But that's what you try to do when you're put on the spot like that.
Alan, did it surprise? I don't know if you heard the comments of Cameron saying that he didn't want the actress Sigourney Weaver in her underwear at the end of the movie. Did that surprise you, or was the story different in the written version? Or
I had not heard that from Mr. Cameron, and there was no mention of underwear one way or the other in the screenplay, as I recall it. But whether he did or he didn't, a lot of time has passed. A lot of film has gone through the projector, so I can't say that anymore. It's all digital. But it's in there for an obvious reason. The studio, I'm sure, wanted it in there, basically so they could use that shot for publicity. I think Sigourney looks great in underwear. Not everybody does. And there are people who are fixated on that and have completely forgotten the rest of the movie. But that's Hollywood. That's motion pictures. Aliens isn't the only film where that occurs. Alien, excuse me, where that occurs. And but there was no mention of that in the original script one way or the other. I'm sure that was a studio request.
Okay.
I did like shortly after Aliens came out, Sigourney Weaver actually hosted Saturday Night Live, and they did an Alien sketch, and they said, they had Phil Hartman was there, and they said there's an alien on the ship. So immediately Sigourney Weaver starts taking off her clothes, and he's like, "Stop it, Sigourney!" So it was just
the actresses that I've met, they understand these things. They know that it's part of the deal. Things have changed to a great degree now. But if it's required by the story, it's something that you do. And, you have something there you have to sell, too. So you have to find a balance between what is gratuitous and what fits in the story.
Well, and that's something that I've always said is that, as far as any kind of graphic content because unfortunately these days with streaming services and stuff, it seems like the producers of shows like Star Trek Discovery and other stuff, they put the graphic content in there just because they can, not because it actually does service the story. If it serves the story, I don't care if it's in there or not. If it doesn't serve the story, it's gratuitous by definition, and I don't care to see it.
HBO lives on that.
Yeah.
Whether it's Game of Thrones or Westworld or Deadwood, they're convinced, rightly or wrongly, that that's what draws viewers. And so it's there. It's just there. Deadwood, to take a real digression here from them, my wife and I love Deadwood. We love Western stories. I've done a series of Western short stories, Western short fantasy stories myself. And the writer, excellent writer, whose name I forget again, so many names, of Deadwood, says that he researched this dialogue and that this is the way people back in the 19th century in Western towns actually spoke. And that's all very well and good. But I felt the nonstop cursing detracted from what was really a nice story. And you just get interested in the characters and the storyline, and then somebody would spew 16 consecutive sentences of invective, and it would take you out of the story. That was my objection to that dialogue. It took me out of the story. And that would be my objection to anything like that visually as well. If it takes you out of the story, then you're cutting your own throat, artistically speaking. Someone please ask Alan what he thinks of the trend of rampant political messaging shoehorned into modern entertainment. Uh, I think it's always been like this. I really do. I don't think it's a modern thing. I think it's always been around. And the Three Musketeers makes comments on the political situation in France at the time, and you can go back and read Roman plays anyway. And they're always talking about this emperor and that emperor, and this general and that general. I don't think it's a modern invention. I just think it's more prominent because we see so much of it visually. I don't think there really is any more of it proportionately than there used to be. I mean, anything pretty much that you read by Charles Dickens has a political slanted perspective, whether he's talking about the workhouses for poor kids or the indifference of the rich. So it's always been there. So it doesn't. It only bothers me if it takes me out of the story. If it contributes to the story or if it's an innocuous insertion, it does not bother me.
Yeah. Elaine, do you have a question for Alan?
What I had what I had in my head before was about film novelizations, and I think Berta Prey covered that pretty well. But just the idea of film novelizations really fascinate me because it's the opposite approach to adapting films from the source material, the books that are already there. And it just seems like such a complicated approach, and exactly what you were saying earlier. So, is it easier to just craft a story right from scratch than it is to adapt a novel from film? What's been your experience, and what is your favorite novelization?
It's much easier to write an original story because you're not beholden to a studio. You're not worried about offending other writers. It's just you and your computer or a typewriter or a dictaphone or whatever you're using. It's much easier to write a novelization than it is to write an original novel. For the obvious reason that your story is there and your character's there. You're just expanding on something that already exists. It's like the difference between building a house on a blank piece of land and remodeling. It's funny how critics and others have reacted to this. If you take a screenplay and make a novel out of it, which is an easier job, it's basically considered by some people hack work. It's just a job. But if you take a novel and get a screenplay out of it, which is much easier than taking a screenplay and making a novel out of it, suddenly you win an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. It's crazy. Never made any sense to me. And I don't say that just because I do it. As far as a favorite novelization, asking an artist to pick their favorite child is really tough. Tchaikovsky didn't think much of the Nutcracker Suite at all. So that's a tough one to pick. I'm very proud of Alien. If I had to pick one, I would pick Alien because I had a very short time frame in which to do it. Fox would not send me any picture of what the alien looked like. So the book is written without any idea of what the alien would look like. They were trying to keep all of Giger's stuff completely under wraps. So if you read the book of Alien, there is no description of the alien. So it's all people trapped on one spaceship. There's no shoot 'em ups in space or anything. So it's all atmosphere and characterization. Difficult to do. So if I had to pick one, I would pick that one. I'm pretty proud of the work I did there, particularly in a short time frame, short even for novelizations. By the way, I should mention that a book of mine called The Director Should Have Shot You, which details the complete history of my involvement with novelizations, starting with the first one, Luan in 1973, will be released by Centipede Press later this year. So that answers a lot of questions that
Awesome.
don't have time to ask, probably don't even have time to think of. But I started at the beginning. I mentioned things in there that I've never mentioned before, not because I thought they would get somebody thrown in jail or worse, elected to office. But a lot of the questions that you might think to ask are answered in that book. I had a lot of fun writing it. I don't take notes. I don't keep a diary, so it's all based on what I could remember. And that's Centipede Press sometime later this year.
Your Director Should Have Shot Me. That's the title, Al?
The Director Should Have Shot You.
Oh, shot you. Okay.
referring to me, but said by,
Gotcha.
and the explanation for that title is in the book too.
Okay. Alan, I want to put up a picture of something that you had mentioned to me about talking about, and I always think it's a fascinating topic. It's not related to what we're talking about, but it's more related to your travels. And I'm just going to put up one of those pictures real quick. And there we go. There we go. Okay.
Not yet.
Okay. There we go. And I wanted to know, what was your firsthand experience of some of these travels in India?
Can you mute me one moment?
Yep.
Okay, it's my.
You're muted, Alan.
While it wasn't nearly that rough, there are some passes in Arizona that's just cut through the rock like that.
Yeah.
That looks amazing.
Makes me nervous just looking at it.
Yeah.
Looks like a Bird of Prey 5 landing site, actually.
You okay? You ready, Alan?
Yeah, I'm good. Okay, I have not been to this particular charming spot, but I have been on roads similar to this. And everybody has a fear. Everybody is afraid of something, whether it's heights or spiders or snakes. I'm not afraid of spiders or snakes or sharks or anything alive, but I don't like heights. And I've fought it over the years because I've flown a lot of places, sometimes in very small airplanes. And it informs your work, but at the time it's happening, you don't want it to. I think this is a road in Bolivia, actually. I think this is the Highway of Death, as it's charmingly called.
Oh, nice.
But I could be wrong. There's a place in Peru called Manu National Park, which is the size of New Jersey, and is still pretty untouched and real National Geographic territory. And I went there in 1987 because I wanted to see real rainforest for the first time. Went with a friend. And the only way to get there at the time was either to go to another place, another town further in the Peruvian Amazon, fly in, and then take a boat up the Madre de Dios River. But the gentleman who was building the first place to stay inside the park, which to this day I think is still the only place to stay inside the park boundaries, was taking supplies down to the building site in the park. And my friend and I made contact with him, and we said, could we go with you? And he named a price, and we paid him. And we went down. He said, you have to ride on the top of the supplies. So we're crammed in the back of a Nissan Patrol, 4x4, on top of a huge pile of boxes and jugs and stuff like that. And you go down this road. It goes from Cusco down into the rainforest. And it's one-way road carved out of the side of the mountain. It's not as wide as the one in the picture here. And it's dirt. I don't know what it's like now, but that's what it was in 1987. And on the side of the road, the drop-off is pretty much like it is in this picture. And it's one way. So the arrangement was that vehicles could go down from midnight to noon, and then from noon to midnight, vehicles could come up. And if you met somebody going the wrong way, you had a situation. And we did. So our guide, our
I think
friend,
this is the road, Alan, you're talking about.
No, that's not it.
Not it? Okay.
No, that's not it. But similar sort of situation, except it's all rainforest around you. It's not bare rock. And we're going down the road, and fortunately, we can't see much of the drop-off because you're in cloud forest. So it's all clouds and fog, which I was very grateful for. But we did meet one truck full of people and supplies coming up the road at the wrong time. And our guide, Boris Gomez Luna, who I think until recently may still be the director of tourism resources for the Peruvian government, but at the time was 22, very interesting young guy, said, please get out. So we got out and walked behind the Nissan while he edged around this truck. And at one point, the rear right wheel was literally hanging off into nothingness. But I guess if you drive these roads, this is the kind of thing you have to deal with. Yeah, that looks like it. Yeah, that could be it. That could be it. He should have kept 3 tires on the road.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, that's basically it. We were on the right side. He went to the right side. The truck went on the inside next to the wall there, next to the cliff. And our friend Boris took his Nissan out on the right there, and he edged a little forward. The truck would edge a little forward. I'm sure they scraped a couple of times. But we, part of us, my friend and I, we saw ourselves walking back to Cusco, explaining to people, that our friend who was building his little lodge in Manu was now part of the scenery. And fortunately, it didn't happen. But those are the experiences you don't have when you're on an air-conditioned group tour bus. They just don't do this sort of thing. The rest of the trip was uneventful, except for me yelling at everybody while we were on the upper Madre de Dios River that there was an anaconda, and it turned out to be a floating log, and I got razzed on that entire rest of the trip.
I have to apologize. Some of you know I'm physically limited at times, and I am going to have to bail out. But Mr. Foster, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you every time you come and do these, because you never seem to be bored of it. To me, I'd be pulling my hair out, but you're a better man than I am, and thank you for being here. But I have to go.
Nice
Thank
to see
you,
you.
Diego.
Take care.
Alan, I got to tell you, I was on a road in the Alps on a really small road that turned into something like this, and I basically at one point said to myself, "This is the dumbest thing I've ever done." I never went down that road again. Alan, how long? I don't want to monopolize your time. How long do we have you for, Alan?
I'm good till I say I'm not good. The thing all writers do best is find ways to avoid writing.
What are you writing now?
I'm halfway through a novel called, isn't that funny? I'm halfway through a novel, and it's, I don't want to describe it. I'm halfway through it. I don't want to give anything away. I have 2 other books that are out, as they say, looking for a publisher. One is called Prodigals, which I had never written an Invasion of Earth story, and I wanted to do something a little different. So I think it does. Another is called Secretions, which is a Commonwealth novel set entirely set on a world where all of the ecology is based on slime. Slime is very interesting stuff, actually. It's very interesting properties, but
Sounds like
those
a
are
place called Kuroga.
But they're both still looking for, the book's called Secretions, looking for a publisher. I mentioned The Director Should Have Shot You comes out later this year. An original fantasy novel, Madringa, comes out from Wordfire Press on my birthday, November 18th, which they didn't realize when they made the publication date, so that's kind of cool. The 90th anniversary issue of Analog Magazine is the September-October issue. I have a story in that. My first story was published in Analog, so that's almost half a century ago. And I'm working on my second symphony, as I mentioned. I'm on the second movement now. Again, I'm sorry that the reproduction there wasn't really good. I could play a little bit.
That's the consequence of the streaming software, Alan. It's not. Yeah, I'm sorry about that too.
That's. I mean, I could pull it up on MusiCore and play a little bit of it, but I don't know what it would sound like via the software. But maybe
if you want to.
Yeah, let's try it just for a second. That's the second movement. I don't want that, and we'll see what happens. Hang on.
And let me just welcome Drew from Bounding into Comics and Sickest of All. Hello, Drew.
Hey, good afternoon. How are you?
Here we go. Let's see if this sounds like anything. I'll only play a tiny bit. Did that sound like anything?
It did
Or
sound
did
like
it not?
something.
It was, the sound isn't great, but yeah, we could hear it.
All right, enough of that.
Quite interesting.
Thank you. That was all strings right there, by the way. Okay.
And this
Alan-
is on your YouTube channel, your music right now, or
No, that was just on my computer. I just played that. I just opened MuseScore
Nice.
and clicked on the file. Now the YouTube stuff is the Nightwish suite, which are it's only 12 minutes for the whole thing, but people can listen to that easily anyway. And here we have Kirk and Spock.
Well, no, this is the Commander Sonak who was killed off in the transporter accident.
Sorry,
And,
I'll fix my.
I just wanted to ask you, Alan, was that your decision to introduce Spock by killing off the first officer in this way, or?
No, that wasn't mine. That was part of the screenplay. There was one thing though, as long as we're talking about the original Star Trek film. I'm not sure if the original one or Star Trek the reboot. It must be the reboot, where Scotty is talking. He's showing his transporter. He's playing around with this little portable transporter that he's invented, which of course is a silly story idea because if you can go anywhere in the galaxy using this little thing that looks like a glass Electrolux vacuum cleaner, you don't need Starfleet anymore.
Right.
But nevertheless, he apparently was doing some experimentation, and it involved an admiral's dog.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah,
Admiral Archer's prize beagle.
Yeah,
yes.
that's right.
We wanted to know what happened to the Beagle.
Well, I wrote the studio, and I said, during the credits or after the credits, why don't you just open that set? It's just the transporter set. It's very simple. And everything is finished, and have the transporter activate, and this very dazed-looking beagle comes stumbling out.
Oh, that
And
would have
walk-
been hilarious.
Oh, yeah. See,
absolutely.
that would have been perfect.
I would have raised the movie by 2 stars.
Yeah, it
Well,
would.
I thought that would have been a nice, go out of the theater moment. But as is usual with studios, they don't want to do stuff like that because even though I said I didn't want anything for it, doing it as a fan and as a writer just for fun, they didn't pay any attention to it. So maybe some fan will do that. It would be very easy to shoot. I'm sure a lot of fans have reproduced the transporter room, and there's got to be a beagle around you can borrow somewhere, and append that to the end of the movie.
I know of at least 2 Beagles
Yeah, just on the
available
stream.
for such thing.
Alan, has anybody ever asked you directly to work on a screenplay?
I've done several screenplays. I've been paid for them, but they've never been produced. So that's where the problem comes from. It's a question of money. And I've done screenplays. I've been paid for them, and nothing has ever happened with any of them. And because of non-disclosure agreements, I can talk about one of them. Co-wrote a screenplay and about the first colonists on Mars, and it is a one-way trip. They will never come back because that's the practical way to do it.
Right.
You can argue the morals of it. I expect the Chinese are working on this right now. You'd have probably 50,000 volunteers, and the trick would be picking the right ones psychologically. But it's a one-way trip, and it's this small group of 4 people, and they end up establishing the first human settlement, as it were, on Mars. And originally it was written for 4 Americans, although it was to be produced in China. It was to be shot in China. Chinese love science fiction. They're looking for things like this. There are no politics introduced into it. And the people who were looking to produce this came back and said, you have to change the screenplay. You have to make, it was all Chinese. It was shot in China. It was going to be a Chinese production. All of the astronauts / colonists were Chinese. And it was the Chinese producers who came back and said, you have to make 2 of the crew American. And this shows you how international the film business was. And we said, why? And they said, for international box office prospects. They were concerned that a film that only featured Chinese would not sell well overseas. So you see, as I always tell people, money trumps everything. Trumps politics, trumps religion, trumps everything. So we went back and rewrote the screenplay, and made two of the crew members Americans. There's also a brief cameo of a very old Elon Musk in a long white beard, which was in the back in the control center for the launch of the spacecraft. I think Elon would probably do that, unless he gets to Mars before. Anyway, this was a done deal. It took the lawyers 6 months to work out the fine points of the contract, at the end of which point the people who wanted to do it said, well, we're not going to do it at this point. It's all a matter of money. It's really not a matter of art. Or you could write the greatest screenplay since Citizen Kane. And if you can't find the money or the people to put up the money for it or the studio to get behind it, your screenplay doesn't get made. That's just the nature of the business. You do it like Robert Rodriguez. You go out, you max out your credit cards, you borrow money from your dentist and your doctor and your family, and you make a film for $25,000 and get it into movie festivals and get it noticed by the studios. And that's how you get films made. It's actually easier today than it's ever been because good cameras are cheap, and you always have a showplace on the internet, if nowhere else.
George, did you want to?
Yeah, I'm really fascinated about your trip to Madagascar, or specifically, you mentioned Mayotte, Mayotte, I believe. Is that the island you're talking about?
Mayotte is the main island in the French Comoros. It's very interesting. That area, that whole area of the Comoros Islands in general, had a vote a number of years ago whether to become an independent country or become a department, an official department of France. This was a French colony. And Mayotte and its surrounding smaller islands voted to remain with France. And now they have a problem with boats of people from the other islands trying to get to Mayotte because the economy there is so much better. You can thank the French taxpayer for a lot of that, but that's the way it is. But yes, Mayotte.
I'm just fascinated.
What about it?
Regarding, well, as a funny aside, my English teacher in grade 10 told me to get my ass in gear or I would fail. So the very first script, the very first writing I did, I looked at the geography ball, and I picked that island as the location for my very first science fiction story that I wrote to get my ass in gear. And when you mentioned it, it kind of blew my mind, sir. I'm just fascinated how.
Well, we're all connected.
I picked it on the map, but how did you actually end up there? That's what fascinates me. And were you just traveling and randomly picking your travels? How did it happen? That's a very unusual place in the world.
I love islands. I love every place, but I also love islands. Unless you've got your own yacht, there are a lot of islands you can't get to unless you take a lot of strange plane connections. The best way to visit islands is on a boat. There is a cruise company called Lindblad, and they were merged with National Geographic not too long ago. Lindblad got promotion, and National Geographic got a cruise line, and they go to very unusual places, Lindblad. They were the first people to take tourists to the Antarctic, for example. I'm pretty sure about that. And I've taken a couple of cruises with them because if you want to go to some place like Pitcairn Island, which has no airport, no air service, and no way to get there except by boat, you either have your own boat or you go with somebody like Lindblad. Well, they had a cruise starting in the Seychelles, going down to the coast of Tanzania, cut across to the northern tip of Madagascar, and go up the island chain of the Seychelles, stopping at, among other places, the French Comoros. I went primarily because the cruise was supposed to stop at Aldabra, which is the only place in the world where you really find giant tortoises, a different species, outside of the Galapagos. And a fascinating, huge, tall, fascinating place to read about. Unfortunately, that was the one place that the cruise couldn't go because at that time, Somali pirate activity was very active in the area, and they had to cancel that stop. But the rest of the cruise was wonderful. We did diving off the northern tip of Madagascar. There are only about 8 or 9 divers on these boats. and nobody had probably ever dove there before. It was fascinating. The seafloor was completely flat rock. I mean, for kilometers, it looked like a giant alien runway. That's what we were all put in mind of. So that was a great thing to see. And that's how I ended up in the French Comoros. And Mbuzi Island is part of the French Comoros group. That's the island where it has been made a sanctuary for the Mayotte brown lemur. And the lemurs clamber all over you and pick your pockets, and a wonderful place. Drew, do you have anything? You just joined us.
Yeah, we actually a couple days ago, Alan, we ran a story in our publication, and there was a rumor that came from a rather large YouTuber, that is plugged into. Well, he says he's plugged into Hollywood quite a bit, and the rumor was that in some form or fashion, things were going to come full circle with Star Wars, and that some point George was going to come back in sort of in some sort of role, and they were going to do something along the lines of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and go with like a sort of new like Star Wars verse. Now, I was going to ask you, since you're
Drew, let me cut you off for a second. These are one of the delights of coming in late to a conversation like this. This was the very first question that was posed.
Oh, okay.
2 hours ago at the start of this discussion. So you can go back and look at it online. I mean,
Okay.
As soon as we could, we asked him.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. We don't want to reiterate here because we are running short on time just a little bit. Yeah. So, sorry.
Alan, did you have a working relationship with or any kind of relationship with Gene Roddenberry?
Yes, it was a Hollywood working relationship. The first time I saw Gene, which was when they were still discussing reviving the TV series, I went down to Norway Productions to meet with various people and have a story conference. And we're walking in a hall, and Gene put his arm around me. Gene's taller than I am, and said, you remind me of me when I was your age. And again, not to be snarky, and I'm very diplomatic, I'm very straightforward. I always tell the truth and what I'm feeling and thinking, which is why I don't work in Hollywood or politics. And, while he's saying this, I'm thinking to myself, well, Gene, I've written half a dozen novels and about a dozen short stories, and I don't think you did that when you were my age, but I didn't say any of that. And of course, the TV series never happened at that time. But I was a bit taken aback by the attitude. I found it patronizing, not to mince words. But I went along. I didn't say anything because what was the point? And I did want to work on and write for the revived TV series. And as is common knowledge and posted elsewhere in many Star Trek sites, when they announced the credits for the film, because you have to file credits with the various guilds, Directors Guild vets director's credits and so on. And I had seen the shooting script, the one the actors carried around with them, for the film while it was in production, and it said, screenplay by Gene Roddenberry and Harold Livingston, story by Gene Roddenberry. And there was some type missing. And I called my agent, who at that time was an old line Hollywood agent, a gal named Ilse Lahn, who had come over from Germany with Paul Kohner. I said, my name is not on the credits, because they filed the credits. I said, I wrote the story for this movie. And she said, don't get excited. This is just the way Hollywood works.
Oh, boy.
And she had represented Charles Bronson and lots of people. She very old, experienced agent. And I said, well, it's not the way I work. I said, it's not the way I work. If they're going to do that, then I'm going to file for sole story credit. And I can prove it. I can prove that I wrote 96% of this story. Wow. So she said, okay. So that's the way we filed it. And then time passed, and I'm a very low-key kind of guy at home. And Ilse called back, and she said, had her people talk to Gene's people. They actually do say that in Hollywood. And she said, Gene can't be bothered with this. He's in La Costa, which was a resort in Southern California, recuperating from overwork. And I threw up my hands and I said, I now understand old line Hollywood. It's actually run by a bunch of 12-year-old boys. And I said, I don't care anymore either. File it the way it was originally, story by me and Gene Roddenberry. That's fine. And they never came back and fussed with it, and that's why I have sole story credit on the movie. At which point my wife, we were still living in Big Bear Lake in California, looked at me, and she wasn't overly fond of either Hollywood or Los Angeles. She's from a small town called Moran in central West Texas. She said, you sure you want to live here to be near these people? And I looked at her and I said, you know what? Let's go find someplace we both like. And I'll write my books. And if anything happens with this business, fine. If it doesn't, that's fine too. And nobody will bother. And nobody will bother me. And it was a really great decision. And we've been in the same house in Prescott, Arizona for 40 years. One of the best decisions I ever made. I don't have to I go into LA occasionally for novelization, to conference with people, and that's rare. And it's all worked out very well. Had I stayed in LA, would I have written more actual movies? Probably. Would I have more money? Probably. Would I get a 1/16th shot of myself in the back of People magazine once a year? Possibly. But it's been a really nice 40 years. I've been able to see the world. Nobody yells at me. My blood pressure is fine. And those are the choices that you have to make in life. I had a lot of contacts in the movie business. You know, I could drop names with the best of them, even at that point. But to me, lots of people love that. To me, it wasn't worth it.
Very true, Alan. And that's a very good advice.
Would I still write screenplays if somebody asked me? Sure. But I wouldn't move back to LA, and I wouldn't go to parties. I don't like parties. And I wouldn't be nice to people that I have to be nice to. Again, being straightforward and always telling the truth and being upfront, even if diplomatically and tactfully, is not a good way to get ahead. Ass kissing is a good way to get ahead. And I just refuse to do that. When you see me, if you hire me to write something, whether it's a book or a screenplay or a radio play or whatever, what you see is what you get. And my wife is like that too. So one thing we get along with really well.
Alan, I have to ask you, and that's very good advice. That's very good advice for a lot of young people who are listening. We have to ask you, what are your thoughts on the Orville? We've heard a couple of thoughts before from you, but where do you want to see Seth and Seth MacFarlane and Tom Costantino take the Orville in the coming seasons?
Judy Lynn Del Rey, who was my editor for a very long time at Del Rey Books, previously Ballantine Books, once told me, she said, science fiction humor doesn't sell. And I would point to books that were selling very well, that were science fiction humor. There's not a lot of them, but they're out there, and they were quite popular. And we would argue about that. And then I would go off and write some science fiction humor and fantasy as well. And I love the combination on the Orville of real science fiction with humor. It works perfectly well. And there's a quote, it's the opening to Moby Dick. I might have mentioned this on a previous podcast, I don't know. And I'm going to have to paraphrase because I don't remember the exact wording. In the opening to Moby Dick, Melville says, there are certain queer times in every man's life when he takes his entire universe for some great cosmic joke, the wherewithal of which he is unaware of, but of which he is certain he is the center point. In other words, he's the butt of the universe's jokes. And I think that would apply pretty well to the Orville too. It's like you go along in what you think is a serious situation, and invariably something stupid and unexpected and totally funny, as the picture you've pulled up happens. And certain types of humor like that can only happen in science fiction. I mean, there's a story, again, by Robert Sheckley, who wrote really wonderful, funny science fiction as well as straight science fiction. where you have a group of guys, it's called the Store of the Worlds, if I remember it, and they're in a spaceship, they're two guys, and they're running out of food and fuel, and they put down on this unknown world, and they find this giant warehouse, and it's an alien warehouse. And they're trying to figure out what each box contains. They're looking desperately for food, but they don't know quite how to, they have a partial dictionary. They don't know quite how to interpret the markings on the boxes. So they'll open one thing, and they're not sure if it's like machine oil or a nutritious drink. And they're going through the warehouse like that, and they open one thing, and it's like this giant gelatinous blob. This sounds like a scene from the Orville. Giant gelatinous blob that starts chasing one of the guys all around the warehouse, and he's trying to fend it off as best he can. And the guy with the dictionary says, there's a mistake here. It's not, and I forget the name of the alien thing. It's not Gleeble, it's not you eat Gleeble, it's Gleeble eats you. Little science fiction humor there. And so I love the combination of science fiction and humor. And I hope that whatever the Orville continues to do, it maintains that humor, but humor that arises out of science fictional situations. There's no point in, well, I'll give you a good example. I'm not writing for this show, but here's an example, is where they're on an alien world, let's say, and they're exploring, and there's a banana peel. It looks just like it's an alien banana peel, but it looks like a banana peel, and they're all very wary of it. And so whoever's in the lead, obviously is wearing a red shirt, steps very carefully over the banana peel into a black hole. And that's Charlie Chaplin when a reporter asked him to describe humor. And Chaplin said, a man slipping on a banana peel is not funny. A man stepping over a banana peel into an open manhole, that's funny. But I just gave a science fictional take on that. Very small black hole, obviously, but still, you get the idea.
Would you write for the Orville, Alan, if they asked you?
Sure, I'd write for the Orville, as long as I don't have to come into LA too much. But nowadays, just like we're conferencing, if you will, now you can use this, or you can use Zoom, and you can have a perfectly good conference without people having to be in the same room together. Arthur Clarke once wrote that as a scene in one of his books, I think from the 50s, where people were very spread out. They hardly ever met each other in person, but they got along just fine because you had 3D images of people who could appear in rooms with other people. That's Arthur anticipating again. So sure, I'd write for the Orville, but not if I had to move back to LA.
An Orville novel would be awesome. What about that?
An Orville novel?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, we're talking novelizations now. I would have no problem with doing that, but novelizations are not what they used to be, because people now have access to the internet and the access to what are called director's cut DVDs, and so there's not as much of a market for it. But all other circumstances being equal, sure, I'd do it. I like the Orville. Why wouldn't I do it? I mean, I think Elaine
meant an original novel, Orville
novel.
novel.
Original novel? No, I don't consider myself sufficiently versed in the Orville universe to attempt that. A screenplay, a teleplay, sure, but a whole novel, and I don't really think. You ask, here's the honest guy again. You see what you get. I don't think the market is there for an Orville novel. It might be among this group and among people who are listening to this group, but from a publisher's standpoint, I don't think they would see it. Novelization, possibly.
Well, they're just getting into comic books, so maybe after some time has passed, they'll look into that.
Yeah, the trick with that is you don't want too much time to pass. You want to strike while the iron's. It's not good for an Orville novel to come out, say, a year after the show happens to stop filming or stop in the air. That just doesn't work with television novelizations. It did with Star Trek, it just did with Star Trek, with the animated show, for example. But that was kind of a special situation. I wish it were otherwise, but there was a novelization of King Kong by Edgar Wallace, and that was hardcover, no less. And that's quite a rare book now. Still crops up at book auctions. So novelizations go way back. It's just what I would novelize, what I'd love to novelize is the 1940 Thief of Baghdad, which is my second favorite film of all time, double Academy Award winner. And the characters in that and the dialogue in that, I think is just astonishing. It's certainly the best Arabian Nights movie that's ever been made. And the best genie, the best evil wizard, which Disney immediately swiped for their Aladdin. Jafar, even the name's the same. But I could talk about that film for hours on end, just that particular picture. But there was no novelization of that, to my knowledge. I'd love to do that. It's a great Arabian Nights story.
Alan, how about
Go ahead.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
How about one real quick question from everybody on the panel before we let you go? Is that okay?
Sure.
George, you said you had a question?
Yes, Alan, a lot of people ask you how to write and all that stuff. My question to you is, during your development of your stories and eventually when they get published, how do you protect your IP, your writings? What steps do you take to protect that stuff?
Okay, I'll try to keep these answers short since they're short questions. The easiest and quickest way is to do what's called a common man's copyright. You take a copy of your manuscript, which means you're going to have to print it out. You put it in a self-addressed stamp return envelope, you mail it back to yourself, and you don't break the seal on the envelope. That's the easiest, cheapest, quickest way. Second way is to go through the Library of Congress and actually get copyright through them. And the third way is to deal with a responsible, legitimate publisher and send it only to those people, because if you write something that that's good enough for them to steal, they're not going to steal it. They're going to publish it and pay you because they want your next book. So there's 3 quickies. Next question.
Michael, do you
Thank
have
you.
Gosh, well, I have about 8 million questions I'd love to ask you, but would you do you see yourself in the future as far as doing more speculative science fiction? Because I got to say, I love your writing, but you know, and I do think that what's missing from modern era science fiction is that it's not a writer's game anymore. It's and so we need people like you writing for our iconic franchises again. Would you consider that?
I'm a storyteller. I've told, I think there's no substitute for a good story. I don't write to trends. I don't have a book in the works about lesbian dwarf transgender mass murderers, on another world or a dystopian world. That's just not me. There's plenty of stuff like that out there if people want that, but it's not what I write. So sure, I'm going to continue doing it. I mentioned those 2 books already, which are straight science fiction. And hopefully they'll find publisher pretty quick. And I'll keep on doing it as long as people keep on reading it.
Bird, do you have a final question for Alan?
We have Drew and Elaine too.
Yeah, or whoever wants to jump in. Drew or Elaine, do you have a...
I'm sorry. Okay, so you novelized 2009 and Into Darkness, but not Star Trek Beyond. Did you have a favorite amongst those 3?
I wasn't asked to novelize Star Trek. That's why
I understand.
That's why I didn't do it. No, I like them both. I think there are fewer. Well, I can't really say fewer errors of science in one than the other. I liked one because it was 2009 because it was a tough job. Rebooting is hard. Rebooting a beloved franchise for anything is really difficult. And I thought 9 did that really well and in an interesting way with a younger crew and a slightly different take on the crew. The science bothered me in both films, but that's just a personal bugaboo, I guess. The science in a lot of Hollywood science fiction really bothers me. So when you get something like Arrival, where it's really good and thought-provoking at that, I just almost jump out of my seat when I'm in the theater. The main thing that bothers me, and then I'll go on to the next question, is people in Hollywood don't seem to grasp the fact the space is really big.
Mhm.
There's a lot of space in space. For example, you can't put up a wall of satellites like in the last Starfighter to keep people out of a certain spot because you just go around it. And you can't really go from one star system to another in a ship of any kind in real time in a minute or two, because even with obscure physics, it just doesn't work. Things like that. That's why Star Wars is not science fiction; it's science fantasy. You don't have a weapon that you're likely to cut your head off with before you hurt the bad guy with. Things like that bother me. But it's just sorry, personal small rant. Drew, have you got something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Elaine and I worked together on a podcast about Battlestar Galactica, the newer one that was out in 2004. And I just wondered, if you had the opportunity to watch it, what were your thoughts really quickly on the newer Battlestar Galactica that was on?
It's people instead of machines. It's better. It's just like we've been talking about for the whole thing. Once you start getting, if the characters don't matter, and I'm not saying there were bad characters in the original Galactica, but if your characters aren't interesting, if Luke isn't interesting, and Leia isn't interesting, and Obi-Wan Kenobi isn't interesting, nobody cares about the rest of the stuff. And this is something that's all too often forgotten in commercial science fiction films. They think it's all about special effects and explosions, and you could apply this to a lot of films. But if the characters aren't interesting, the situation isn't interesting, then nobody really cares about the film. Elaine, have you got something? We'll finish up with you.
Well, I just wanted to say that I've just been blown away by your comments about science fiction, just your approach to storytelling and your creative integrity. It really speaks to my soul and really speaks to what I feel about science fiction. So it's been such a pleasure to hear from you today. I've just been enjoying it and in awe of it. But I just wanted to ask, I guess, just what specific thing are you most looking forward to as far as science fiction shows or movies that are coming out? Is there anything that you're particularly looking forward to?
First, I have to compliment you on your still suit take on your avatar.
Thank you.
It's hard to do any kind of a still suit where you still see the person's face, but I live in Arizona.
I know, I tried.
I live in Arizona, so I see stuff like that all the time. Well, the main thing would obviously be the remake of Dune and then Apple's production of Foundation. The teaser for Foundation looks really nice. There's a lot of tech in there. Space elevator, no less. Arthur wrote about that too. I just hope that it doesn't get overwhelmed with talk, because the books themselves are basically talk, and yet still manages to be visually interesting. They're obviously going to have to introduce some sort of action into that isn't in the books. Ike isn't here to object, so. But it's one thing to do that as a series of books and a series of stories. It's another thing to put it on television. We'll see. The TV adaptation of Dune on the Sci-Fi Channel was pretty good. You have a smaller screen, so you don't need to go as big with some of the tech stuff. And we'll just have to wait and see. Those are the two things. I also follow a lot of short films. I just watched a short animated film today called Spice Something. It's fully animated in Disney style, charming little short film. I wish I could remember the last half of the name, but it starts with spice, interestingly enough, nothing to do with Dune, more to do with cinnamon and sea salt, interestingly enough. And there's a lot of very, very good short science fiction, whether it's traditional animation or CGI or stop motion. It's out there. You can find it on YouTube. I recommend that fans do some searching. There's some terrific stuff out there. And it shows what you can do with a small budget, and you can do real science fiction.
Wow, Alan, I want to thank you for being so generous with your time, and so for us being able to ask you questions has just been an honor. And is there anything else you would like to mention before you leave us?
I mentioned forthcoming work. I don't know about actual production of my music. Nobody's doing concerts now anyway, so it's kind of a moot point. But I'd like to continue to do both. What I've discovered is if I work on a book in the morning and the music in the afternoon, they're both done. And if anybody is desperately curious to hear like pieces of the symphonies or something like that, they can always email me, and I can break up the files and do one movement in per file, and people can hear other stuff. So,
and is there you said there was a place we could go to listen to those? Is there a link?
The Nightwish Suite. No, I don't have a specific link, but there are two places. You can go to my fan website, which if you just go to Facebook and me, and then go over to videos, because you can't do just a sound file. You have to do it as a video. Go over to videos. You can see all six movements of the Nightwish Suite. As I said, they're all about 2 minutes long. Or you can just go to Google. They're posted, to YouTube. They're posted there, and just Google Nightwish Suite. You don't even have to put my name in, and they will come up. There are 6 movements. Each one is an impression, not a portrait, an impression of each member of the band, which I think is the best band in the world right now. And the music isn't quite like anybody else's. The composer and keyboardist, Tuomas Holopainen, is a real composer. He's not a songwriter, he's a composer. And the band has been around for 25 years, and they're a national institution in Finland, although the lead singer is Dutch, Floor Jensen. And if you ever wanted to see what a singing Valkyrie looked like in person, Floor is a little over 6 feet and wears 4-inch heels on stage. You just look at one of the Nightwish videos and you'll have wish.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's at alandeanfoster.com. Thank you, LDG. Alan, thank you so much. I'm going to put again some of your music for the for signing as we sign off now, and thank you so much. I want to thank the panel. I want to thank everybody who's in here. LDG Pixels, CCDV, Tink, Dave, Bob, Terry, Jet, Fortian. I know there's a lot of questions that have been asked, but like Alan said, you can email him a question as well. Captain Robert, Fortian, everybody who's been in here, thank you. Thank you again, Alan. Thank you, panel. God bless everybody. Stay safe. Let's make everything. Let's take care of America, and let's everything get better so things can get up and running again.
Yeah, I'm gonna wear my Darth Vader mask to the grocery store next time, just for shits and
Awesome.
I'm looking to see if what you play of my music is listenable or as screechy as it was when we opened the program. It's not a criticism. I'm curious.
Yep. Unfortunately, I have to play it through the speakers, Alan, because I can't do it any other way. So, but I'm okay.